Right, so this talk I'm going to give is it's based on work that I've been doing for a book that I'm writing on the kind of interwar entertainment, theatre, cabaret scene in Egypt. The book kind of focuses more on the rise of the feminist movement and particularly focusing on the women who ran their own dance halls, cabarets and theatre troupes. And I try and use kind of this particular sort of milieu to think of another way of looking at sort of the rise of feminism. Now I thought a better sort of topic for this audience would be see what this can tell us about the sort of cosmopolitanism of Egypt and how we can look at it in a slightly different way. So I've often found in the conventional story that we're only being told sort of a part of a larger picture, and despite the huge sort of diversity of Egypt at the time, we get a sense that cosmopolitanism is isolated in small groups who don't tend to sort of be cosmopolitan between each other, just sort of within each other. But when you look at the sort of press reports and the memoirs and things about cabarets and theatres in Egypt at the time, you find that there's really this huge wealth of different people from different backgrounds who come together without some of the apparent barriers that we see in other places. They sort of interact across a wide spectrum of Egyptian society. So I'm starting with this picture. It's having said what I've just said, it's a slight red herring. It's a photo of the Yiddish theatre troupe in Cairo. It's actually from 1916, but it seems we have a lot more data about the activities of this particular theatre troupe from the 30s, and we know that in that period, as well as a Yiddish theatre troupe, there was also a Ladino theatre troupe, a Hebrew theatre troupe, and the Jewish community was performing plays in French and Arabic. So this sort of demonstrates at least how far across all different communities the interest in the theatre goes. But it's slightly a red herring because the Yiddish theatre troupe was mostly giving plays to the Yiddish audience, and likewise with the Ladino troupe. Whereas I want to try and look at places where everyone comes together. And so when I'm talking about the sort of theatre scene, I'm going to use lots of different words for it, but I'm sort of roughly always talking about the same thing, the nightlife and entertainment scene. What I'm really talking about is, things that mostly happened around the Ezbekaya Gardens. Ezbekaya, named after a Mamluk emir, Ezbek, who used to have his palace there. There we go. So this is an earlier one, 1902. This is slightly clearer from 1921. In the gardens, there was a large lake here, which was filled in by Muhammad Ali, and these gardens were set out by the Khedive Ismail. So in the mid-19th century, this was already becoming an area where there were music halls, there were bars that offered drinks, and apparently billiards was the big thing to do in the bars. There was an Italian theatre there, which was rather short run. But the really big development of the area comes in the late 1860s. 1868, the Khedive builds a théâtre de comédie, followed by a circus, a hippodrome, and an opera house. This is a picture of the opera house from, I guess that's the 40s or 50s or something. And he remodeled those gardens. The head gardener of Paris and the man who designed the Bois de Boulogne is the person who remodeled the gardens for him. And as with many things, Ismail kind of overcommitted in his building projects, and only the opera house really survived. The theatre comedy, the circus, and the hippodrome all disappear. By the 1890s, they're gone. But his efforts to bring in theatre troupes and things had lasting effects. The troops that he brought from Europe, inspired Egyptians to create their own Arabic drama, and then in the 1880s particularly, a number of troops coming from Syria built their own theatres to show Arabic plays in the area. And alongside these theatres there are several music halls, cafés chantants, bars for enough. So the most famous one, which actually is from the 1860s, is the Ancien Eldorado, which is pictured there. But there are many others, and other kinds of entertainment appear. It becomes known as a sort of area of slight dissolution, bars, there's gambling, there's hashish dens. In the 1880s, when the British start to regulate prostitution, the red light district sort of comes into areas around here. So from the late 19th century, it has a reputation for debauchery, but also for cosmopolitanism. In 1894, an agent of the Khedive, who's Abbas Hilmi II at the time, was tasked to kind of keep an eye on the area, see what the elite were doing, and government employees. And his letters that he sends back to the Khedive, which are in Durham archives now, says, "You find pashas and beys, omdas and intellectuals, along with playboys, drinking with foreigners, both Jewish and Christian. You see a Muslim drinking, he's scandalized, drinking a glass of wine to the health of a Christian, as if the Quran had not forbidden the consumption of alcohol." So already by the 1890s, we're starting to see this place as a place where communities can mix. And as we keep going into the 20th century, it becomes a boom in the 1920s, particularly the Opera House is here, and the Theatre Comedy, I think, is here. The area previous to the 1920s, where everyone was going out, is here, and it moves up to this street, the Medellin, which becomes famous as the Broadway of Egypt, it gets called. And so as travel became easier as well, Cairo's population became more diverse in the 20th century, and this was obvious in the world of music and dance in particular, perhaps because we don't see the language problems. So to give a few examples, this is the Medellin Street as well in 1920, and this is the Consul Music Hall, owned by a man called Augusto Del Bagni, and he employed two seasoned African-American musicians called George Duncan and Billy Brooks to put together a jazz band. In fact, in the 1920s in Cairo, there were several African-American musicians, and Brooks and Duncan were not even the most successful ones. In fact, there was a bigger jazz band that was playing around the fancier hotels, but they had to play in the music hall on Medellin Street. But what we do have is their letters back home to a newspaper in Chicago. So it tells us a little bit about how their band was made up, what kind of people were playing in it. So this is them, Billy Brooks. They're totally fascinating. Leave America in the 19th century and travel all around. But we can't talk too long about them. But they start off playing in the Devil's Jazz Band, that's what they call it, and it's 4 Greeks and them. But they soon reorganize. They get a new lineup. They bring in a Russian Jewish pianist who apparently played the piano so lightly that if you did not look his way at times, you would not know he was touching the keys. And a Polish Jewish banjo player who they quite liked. He was born in Egypt, and they say he doesn't thump the Joe badly. A Greek trombonist and a Russian woman on the drums who made what they called thunder and lightning effects. They said, she certainly makes the big drums sweat. But as I've been kind of trying to say, jazz in Egypt also garnered an audience amongst local Egyptians too. A few months later, they made another change to their lineup and got an Egyptian drummer who had started by watching the more successful drummer who was operating in Egypt at the time, Seth Jones, who had played in Ciro's Club in London, and then Ciro's Club in London wanted an outpost in Cairo, so they sent him along to organize the orchestra. And according to Brooks and Duncan, this young Egyptian caught on to the jazz stuff pretty well. And they themselves caught on to Cairo pretty well as well. Having left America in 1878, as they said, they traveled around with an Uncle Tom's Cabin show, decided to cash in their return tickets, and went around the world, Europe, Russia, South America. In 1914 is when they end up in Cairo. And there they kind of find a sense of freedom, particularly in being in an African country, which they didn't find in America. So in one of his letters, he talks about a white American asking him, "Oh, why don't you go back to America?" They say, "Oh, you must be enjoying yourself so much in Egypt." And so he replies, "Well, why should not I have a good time here in a black man's country? You have a good time in America, which you call a white man's country. We're on the same flank as you, and if anything, if anything happens." we have to say, good morning, judge, we have a square deal of the cards when it's our turn to deal. So they found kind of a freedom which they didn't have in America. As well as musicians, Cairoan dancers also came from all over the world. So dance had a long history in Egypt, of course, and was a very popular entertainment in Cairo in the interwar period. Many theatre troupes, particularly the vaudeville ones of Naguib al-Rahani and Ali al-Qassar, had their own dance acts, and there would be sort of music numbers between plays and sketches. In 1916, this woman, Dolly Smith, comes to Egypt from London. She apparently had a diploma in dance from Hayes. I'm reading this from the Arabic, so I don't know. I couldn't find out if that was actually a place in the UK. But she had a diploma in dance, and she immediately began to work for Naguib al-Rahani's troupe, where she led the dance troupe, basically, and then transferred to Ali al-Qassar's. Several other dancers about whom we know less also appeared on these vaudeville and cabaret stages. So one troupe leader called Munira al-Mahdeya, very famous woman, employed a troupe of Sudanese dancers in the 1930s. Badia al-Musadni's cabaret, casino, gives lists of a wide variety of all these different people. Buck and Chick, the kings of Basu, Yolande, the eccentric dancer, the Garbo Orgio, etc., etc. The theatre too, sort of more conventionally thought of theatre, had people from all nationalities. So Syrians and Lebanese, as I said, had played an important part in creating Egyptian theatre. Many of the big actors at the time were still of Syrian origin. There's this actress Ihsan Cairo was Armenian, and we were reputedly the lover of the musician Said Darwish, and also the actor Yusuf Wakbi. This woman, Aida Habashea, we know very little about. Her name means kind of the Ethiopian. She apparently came up in the early 20s, acting in comedy, but then sort of disappears from the scene. Claude Ricano, we do know a little bit more about. He's European in some way. He's Spanish, but might not be. Appeared often as the sort of in the role of foreigner on the stage. And just as in the 1890s, there's people of Muslim, Christian and Jewish background across all of these. And so what I sort of, I don't want to keep on going on people, so what I sort of found here was a kind of cosmopolitanism that I wasn't quite used to. A cosmopolitanism in the Arabic language, one, and with a very different focus, Middle Eastern focus, including Europeans, but including people from all over the world. In fact, all over Ahmed Deen, Ezbekay, and the downtown Cairo area, there are surprising people come up all the time. There's Khurshid, the palm reader. There's this doctor who you can go to for your sexually transmitted diseases. There was another. There were several actually mediums and kind of spiritualists at the time. One from Palestine, Iraq, called Dr. Darhish. And I just want to name one last person before I sort of move towards conclusion, because I think he really embodies something about the world of theatre which ties it to its cosmopolitanism. So I've sort of become convinced that the performance itself is what allows people to slip in and out of different identities and sort of mix together. In other words, I mean, it's not just a coincidence that we find such a wide, diverse, cosmopolitan crowd in this theatre scene. So this is Dr. Tapreve, a young Armenian born as Krikor Kalfayan, born in the Nile Delta, somewhere, perhaps Tanta, perhaps Mansoura, we're not sure. As a child, he lived between Istanbul and Greece, training as a doctor. And after the First World War, he travelled to Cairo, where in an Armenian charitable association, he got put up in a hotel in Clock Bay Street, which is, probably gone too many places now. Which, again, is just up here somewhere. Where is it? It ought to be here. There you go. Anyway, in this area. So put up in a hotel there, which is where he comes up with his character, Dr. Tapreve, the Egyptian fakir. His act combined kind of hypnotism with feats of physical endurance. He could put himself in a catatonic state in front of an audience. He could even put small animals like rabbits and chickens into the same catatonic state. He performed for a while in Cairo, took his show to Alexandria, then to Paris, and became a minor celebrity. This is this character in Tintin, Ragdalam the Fakir. It's apparently based on him. He travels around. He comes to London as well, dressed in very sort of his white Oriental style clothing of a slightly unclear origin, and then returns to Cairo, gets a luxury apartment in downtown Cairo, sets up an institute of Taparism, perhaps more publicity tool than an actual institute. But he seems to me to be a perfect example of the sort of freedom and flexibility that this downtown Cairo scene could offer to people. He plays with his own background, sometimes emphasizing the Egyptian-ness of his birth, sometimes emphasizing the sort of Western degree he got in Greece, sometimes talking about his Armenianness. He can do it all, turning himself into a kind of theatrical character. And I think the same thing, to different degrees, can be said of a lot of people who I've shown already. I don't want to totally romanticize the picture of Egypt in this period. I think there are a few qualifications that we do need to add. So obviously this was a colonial period. There were discrepancies in power. The most obvious embodiment of this is the system of capitulations, which is by which foreign nationals were tried by their consular courts rather than by Egyptian ones, which created a sort of stratified legal system by which certain people were essentially above the law. So the two jazz artists, Brooks and Duncan, summed it up as my title when they said, Egypt is a country where the Egyptians reign, so the king is Egyptian, the English rule, and everyone does as he pleases. The system of capitulations was a particular target for campaigners against the sex trade and trafficking in women. And one owner of a theatre cabaret in Ahmed Dean Street, called Marcel Langlois, was suspected of essentially being a procuress, prostituting her artists to wealthy customers who came out for a night out. But because of her French consular protection, it was almost impossible to actually do anything about it. And raids on places whose owners had consular protection required the consent of the consul. Often it took a lot of work just to find out what the nationality of any particular subject might be, and sometimes the consuls themselves were obstructive. So we have an example of this. There's a cafe on Ahmed Dean Street. It's called the Café Carillon, which was a well-known hangout for pimps, French pimps particularly, who have names Paul Le Petit, Louis, two Louis, who are just distinguished by one is l'Australien and the other is l'Algérien. But a lot of people wanted these men to be arrested, or at least have their activities halted. However, it's always said that the French consul, Mr. Joseph Levy, constantly stopped any attempt at their prosecution, seemingly warning them of raids or helping them out in other ways. Suggested by campaigners that he personally knew at least two of the pimps, and all of this led people to declare in letters that if one could get rid of the French consul general, Cairo and Alexandria could be cleaned up a lot. And when you look back at the reports of these times, it seems easy sometimes to sort of mock the puritanism of the people writing the reports. But they were dealing with very serious issues of exploitation, which were being blocked by this system of capitulation. So I don't think we shouldn't be too romantic about about everything that was going on. But still, having added that caveat, we must also be true to the multiculturalism of this period, which I think we can show for sure. So in Egypt, historiography of this theatre scene has tended towards a more nationalist reading, so the people who get remembered are often the people who can be painted as Egyptian heroes. One of the most famous people who came up during this period, of course, is Kulthum, the great singer, who started on these stages. And there's a sense that the fact that she can be portrayed as this girl from the village, national hero, is part of the reason why she's become the huge persona that she is. I mean, obviously, she's also a great musician, but likewise, another artist, Munira Al-Mafdea, I'm working on for this book particularly, is an extremely charismatic troop leader, the first female troop leader in Egypt, but she always gets remembered as the first Egyptian Muslim woman to act on the stage, which may or may not have been true. I mean, it's quite hard to figure out often in the late 19th century who's who and what religions they are. But it sort of obscures some of her memory and the dimensions to her character that she's only remembered as that. So in this particular kind of more nationalist way of telling the Egyptian cabaret scene, we lose a lot. And one final person who I'm going to talk about, who has apparently been totally lost, is Isaac Dixon. His name is there, or I've only seen his name in Arabic, so it could be spelled with an X or a KSON, or who was the trainer, the dance choreographer at Badiam Musabni's casino. He continued there through the 1940s. He trained two of the most famous dancers in Egypt, Samia Gamal and Tahir Galioka. In the late 1940s, he worked on films, and in the 50s, he worked as a dance trainer in a number of films. This is from the film Cigaro Orquest. And this is him playing a minor role in a film about Mustafa Kemal. But now, no one seems to know anything about who he was or what happened to him. Both Tahir Galioka and Samia Gamal mention him as an influential trainer, but he is sometimes called English, he's sometimes called Austrian, sometimes Spanish, sometimes Lebanese, sometimes he's Jewish, sometimes he's not Jewish. He appears to have stopped doing anything in 1955, doesn't seem to have done anything after 1956, which perhaps is the reason why people suggest he's Jewish, but we don't have much more evidence than that. So, yeah, he is one of the people who has fallen through the cracks. And I was going to end up by showing a video, but I don't know if we even have time for that. So yes. I don't know how to do it. Do we need to click on the thing now?
Click on the
monkey. So this is a video from Cigaro Orquest, where it's the main song, which he choreographed. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Are you going to skip that?
Thank you very much indeed, Raphael, for that glimpse of another Cairo. Nowadays it will probably be arrested and put in prison. Any questions? We want to hear more about Isaac Dixon. Any questions?
I was wondering if Cairo is really unique, it's not very unique at that time, but with some of the other big cities of the land, were there sort of comparable things happening at the same time, like Beirut or Athens or Costa?
I mean, I can't answer that perfectly, but Cairo is, in a certain sense, Egypt is always referred to as extremely cosmopolitan, and the entertainment scene really is very focused in Egypt. So Beirut, for instance, I think only has one really. Everyone who travels to Beirut to tour always seems to play at the same theatre.
Right.
And when Badiam Musabni, who runs the casino, goes to Beirut in her youth, she talks about how there's only basically one cabaret dancing. So in terms of the entertainment scene, Egypt is definitely bigger.
So that sort of range and scale of entertainment is sort of completely, yeah.
It's not unparalleled, but I think Egypt is the biggest, and historically it's sort of known as the biggest.
I'd imagine Alexandria as well, because that was a port.
No, Alexandria definitely was important, and what people tended to do was go to Alexandria in the summer and be in Cairo in May.
Yes, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I was actually going to raise the same question.
There were many in Istanbul and
Yeah. Yes.
Any other questions?
I was wondering about the belly dancing essence of the whole
Mm-hmm.
She's
industry. can we say it comes all from belly dancing because there is no other country the woman can as good as belly dance as Egyptian?
Yeah, I mean, and it's definitely a part of it. The history of belly dancing is sort of fascinating in itself. But it seems to be a lot of people do everything. They will dance and they will sing and they will act as well. But there were still, I mean, as Philip was saying, people get arrested now. People did get arrested back then. So in the 20s, they banned belly dancing for a while, and theatres would be closed down.
In the 20s,
Yeah.
More questions? Yes.
If belly dancing, having lived in Egypt for 3 years, belly dancing is originally it's folk dancing. This is why children do it. It's the way they express themselves, and then we've added another sort of aspect to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious how you could ban belly dancing, or did they ban it in public?
They banned it in sort of in dance halls, basically.
Well, I mean, all Egyptian girls learn
Yeah.
belly dancing.
But one more question over here.
Yeah, I know the obviously Alexandria had the big Greek community, but were there a lot of Greeks involved in Cairo in the sort of theatre?
There were, I mean, there was a lot of everyone. There definitely were Greeks. I didn't really show any particular ones, but one person who I'm very interested in, who's in Cairo, there was in the 1910s, a women-only theatre troupe was set up, and they said they had a person between the sets to do skits, and she was called Androniki, but we don't really know anything else about her. But yeah, lots of.
Over there?
Yes, can I ask about your archival sources? Where do you find material? Is it all over the place?
So a lot of the material comes from journal, like contemporary journals. The Secret Police Guide from 1890s, that comes from Abbas Hilmi papers in Durham. I think my biggest source is the contemporary journals. There's also generally, although some in French, like those ones like that. And those letters from Egypt come from the Chicago Defender.
You're fluent Arabic.
Yeah, give or take.
Over there.
Hi, I've got a question. In your research, have you come across any of interaction between your theatre people and New Zealanders or Australians during the First World War?
None specifically. There is one very famous incident, or in fact, in all the memoirs, everyone always refers back to this incident in 1917, where who then became the greats of Egyptian theatre went to do a sort of small act on a theatre. I think it was Marcel Langlois' theatre, Procuress, and they all get pelted by soldiers with tomatoes and things. But I don't think they specifically. I mean, you probably know there's sort of a stereotype of the Australian soldier in Egypt.
They did have a lot of interaction in the red light district.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's several books about that mostly, but I haven't found anything from the other perspective.
Yeah. Okay.
Another question here.
Quickly, when did Isaac Dixon appear on the scene? 1930s?
Yeah, pretty much like.
Did you have you checked the who's who in Cairo? There were a few online.
Oh, yeah, that's a
and
great idea,
it doesn't include artists.
Yeah.
So that might be a possibility.
Thank you.
Over there.
I also have a question about the sources. Did you manage to maybe talk to the embassies in Cairo, the French, English, and if they have any archival material that you can peek into?
No, I don't think that's a good idea. Because finding archival material is extremely difficult.
So the consul court's records were repatriated.
Yeah, they're all in Kew.
So presumably we have reference.
Yeah.
Any more questions? No. Well, thank you to both our speakers for a really wonderful evening.